Welcome to the Page Turnerz Podcast, where book lovers unite to celebrate the enchanting world of fiction. With your host, Paul A. Brooks. In each episode, we'll dive into the captivating realms of storytelling, exploring the pages that transport us to magical places and introduce us to unforgettable characters. In each episode, we'll embark on a creative expedition through the minds of seasoned and emerging writers to unravel the mysteries and unveil the passion that fuels their stories. Join us on this odyssey through the pages and pixels of imagination, where words become worlds and stories illuminate our lives. So, pour yourself a coffee and immerse yourself in discussions about writing, gripping plots, heroes and villains, and the sheer joy of escaping into a well-crafted story.
In today's show, I got to speak to award-winning author J.E Schleicher, who writes stories that leave behind a fantastical aftertaste long after you finish reading. Now, his short fiction has appeared in Creepy Podcast and will appear in the Writers of the Future Volume 40 and Black Hair Press's Patreon. Now, he's currently novelising his short story Squiddy, which was the winner of the Writers of the Future Award. And when he's not writing or reading, you'll find him in the mountains near his home in Montana. Now, we really nerded out and had a great time talking about writing, his journey and his work. So I hope you enjoy it. Hi, John. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks very much for coming. You're in Montana, that's right, isn't it?
Yes, I'm in Missoula, Montana.
Wow.
So in the throes of winter, which this winter is actually it's been quite mild. So it's not as cold as it's been in past winters.
I've looked at some of your images on Instagram. Are they from where you live?
Yes, right. So I live in the northern Rocky Mountains of the U.S. So spectacular scenery. I'm quite fortunate to be able to see that and to explore it. And that's besides writing and reading literature at large, that's kind of a passion of mine is the outdoor recreation, just kind of getting out, kind of where I can find transcendence and feel insignificant, the good insignificance, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of beauty around me, which I'm quite grateful for.
That's fantastic. So you are a multi-genre writer, sci-fi, horror, and fantasy?
Yes, right.
So do you find that when you're out and about hiking that you get sort of inspiration from your surroundings? We'll talk more about the genres individually at the moment, but is that where you kind of get your inspiration from?
I wouldn't say the inspiration, but I get some inspiration for sure. A lot of my stories, setting plays prominently, in particular the natural world. And so that's where I can be present in the moment when I'm out there. And so I try to get that into my writing and transport the reader to try to get them in that trance, so to speak, so they can just be fully immersed into my story. And so I use it as a technique, right, to capture the reader's attention. But in some stories, they are inspiration for, and they, the creative process is so mystical. But it finds its way into my stories and then shapes the story because of the setting and the natural environment around it. So I don't know if it's a chicken or egg type of a thing, but it is what it is.
It is, absolutely. How do you decide what genre that you're going to write in, or do you just kind of under the umbrella of speculative fiction, I suppose? Do you kind of take elements of horror, sci-fi, and fantasy and put them together so it becomes a speculative fiction piece?
Right. So I do have some stories that are a mashup between the genres, but I let the story dictate where I go, and I don't set up like I'm writing a science fiction or I'm writing a horror. It kind of comes to be. And so generally there's going to be a fantastical element to my stories, for sure, not for sure, but often a science fiction, too. And so I don't know what the story will be because I'm a pantser. I'm a discovery writer, right? And so there's a lot of discovery that comes in the process, and that goes to the genre too.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm exactly the same. I was going to ask you if you're a plotter or a pantser, but you kind of answered that immediately, which is great. And I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of, the story sometimes takes on a life of its own, and it sort of almost directs us as the writers in terms of where it's going. I mean, sometimes I find that, I've written something and I read it back and I think, where on earth did that come from? That kind of wasn't in the original sort of idea of where the story was going, but it just kind of evolves naturally. And when you're writing horror scenes, I mean, there's in my book, there's quite a lot of violence in it. No, that's not quite true. There are some violent elements to it, which kind of makes up the story. When you're writing yours, how do you see it? Do you kind of play the movie in your mind and write down what you see, or is it a little bit more technical than that?
No, it's the former. So I envision the scene, and I try to get the senses, and vision is a big part of that. Now, the process is not a one and done thing, right? So I write multiple drafts, and so I'll read one draft and I'll be like, oh, I'm missing this element, to try to transport the reader. Okay, let's make sure I get a sense of smell in there. Let's make sure I get a sense of feel, right?
Brilliant. Yeah.
I'm really the character's lacking the emotional, like, just feelings towards the situation, or it's not how the character's reacting. It's not a realistic reaction once I'm away from it. Like, oh, wait a minute, why did she or he or did they do that? And so it's a whole bunch of decisions as I revise that just kind of tweak the story to have the final product before I send it out there.
Wow, that's a really good way. I mean, I kind of do something similar in as much that I edit the before I start writing what I've written the previous day. So I suppose it's a similar sort of process to you, and as I kind of cycle back.
Yes, and I think it also just comes from how my process. So being a pantser, you know, you have your outliners, you have your pantsers, and those are, I mean, and there's definitely different ways to draft the story, but those are the prominent ways.
Yeah.
And the way I look at it is kind of a redistribution of work. So if for those who outline, there's a lot of work done, world building, character development, etc., before they start drafting, right?
Yeah.
But as a pantser, I'm discovering the story, and so once I type the end, that's just the first draft, and there's going to be plot holes. There's going to be cul-de-sacs. The character development is not going to be great, so I'm going to have to go back in, and that's when I pull up the authorial elbow grease, right?
Yeah.
And spend a lot of time. So, but that process for me is like, I find outlines very restrictive, and I think it's the perception of restriction, and so the less obstacles I can have to get the story out, the better.
Yeah.
And so outlines don't work for me, and I've learned that I might have a rudimentary outline to kind of move the character along, but so many times I even like toss that out, and it's a whole different story. So
I know exactly. I mean, sometimes I have some bullet points at the end just to kind of remind me of the sorts of things that I want to put in. But in terms of ideas, I mean, I've got so there's two notebooks here, there's one here, and then there's a whiteboard behind me. So, but actually, I find, I don't know if you're the same, but if an idea pops into my head earlier than sort of, when I want to write it, often that idea just goes straight out the window. It never gets used. Do you find that?
Oh, absolutely. So, and I'll get into the Squiddy, but a little bit later in our conversation. But the conception of the idea, I've recently, so my wife and I, we've moved, and in the move, I found this note card where the origin stories of our idea of Squiddy, and it was entirely different from what the story actually was. But it got me, I wanted to write about really addiction and how we respond to despair. And so I wanted these aliens that were addictive, and that humans were addicted and sought to soften despair from. But how that came to be, like, it was entirely different species of alien, different character, etc. But that was the genesis. That was the theme that I wanted to explore. But it was, I mean, entirely different than what I actually wrote on this note card.
Yeah, but that's Squiddy is the one, the story that you won the Future Writers Award for, isn't it?
Right. So yeah, it's going to be in volume 40 of Writers of the Future. And so for those unfamiliar with the contest, Writers of the Future contest is a science fiction fantasy contest for emerging writers. And if your story wins, you're going to be in an anthology of with the other winners. But then you're flown out to Hollywood, where you participate in a workshop with a bunch of well-known established authors, and then you have an award gala as well, and they work to really, it's a lot of speculative fiction writers have launched their careers kind of from Writers of the Future. So I'm over the moon about finally winning. I've been working to win this contest for a long time, and finally my skills have met the and the story kind of met in place that it's gonna happen.
That's really good. It comes out, is it May that it comes out?
It does, right. So volume 40 comes out in May. You can pre-order the volume now. It's available, but it will be published in May.
That's great. I mean, once we're done, I'll put links to your website and everything, so it'll be in the descriptions of all of these, so people can go there and sort of pre-order, which is great. And I'm going to be one of them for sure. So no, absolutely. So it's great. I'm kind of looking forward to that. So what is your writing process then, John? When you sit down to write, do you have a word count? Do you write for a period of time? It's sort of in sprints. How do you do it?
Right. So, I try to avoid word count goals. And that's, that's for me, my goal each day is just to show up. So I'm less concerned about word count, and for good reason, because I'm a slow writer. I'm slower than your average bear at drafting. And so if I hung my writerly hat on word count as kind of like the determining variable of success, I'd be, I don't know, disgruntled, crotchety writer, full of self-loathing, right? Which, I can be at times too. But, besides that point, as I see it, not every word is equal. I'd much prefer spending all day, even like if it's pounding my head against the table, to write a beautiful paragraph where that's chalked with, each word playing double duty or triple duty for to progress the story along, and compel the reader to keep reading, than to spend all day writing thousands of words and that's what it would be for my process if I was just concerned about word count, not to discredit others who do, but altogether it would be meh. So I kind of I look at time spent with the craft. There's so Susan Griffin, she's a poet and novelist, and she has a book on craft that I read about the creative process, and she has a metaphor that really resonates with me, and it's kind of changed the way that I look at writing. And she compares the creativity to a cat as opposed to a dog, and so you can't order creativity to come to you, but if you show up and if you're there, it might just jump in your lap. And make itself, but you have to make yourself available to do it. So it's not like I'm waiting for a muse, right? And I'm only writing when the muse is here. I sit down in front of a blank screen, and sometimes I sit down for a long time, and that's what it takes for me to write. But I know if I show up, my creativity or the story will show up as well. And so that's my goal, is to show up, and I try to do it each and every day, and try to keep myself void of distractions when the going gets tough. That's I guess it's still my process, and to look at, but it's not always like that. As far as being able to avoid those distractions, some days are better than others. Some days I might have the bandwidth to write a story. Some days I don't. I have to try to be kind to myself too, but it's an evolving process.
And the family as well, I suppose. You've got to give
exactly.
Time. It's really easy to I've found this myself. It's really easy to get lost in your world. When you and all of a sudden 5 hours has gone, and I haven't moved from this chair. And sometimes,
right.
That kind of, I love that cat analogy though. That's really good. I really like that. I did try myself to keep a spreadsheet of the word count that I did, but I found that it became almost competitive, and I had to beat the previous day. And I felt that potentially the quality of, as you said, not every word is equal. I think the quality of what I had written in the first draft suffered a little bit. Not in a little bit, quite a lot, because I always try to create as clean a first draft as I can, so that, you know, I haven't got to go back quite so much. I mean, certainly in terms of developmental editing, there's always scope for improvement and things that you can fill in. But yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. I try not to. Maybe it's very kind of plottery, having a word count. It's the sort of thing that a plotter would do and have a graph, maybe. Yeah, I don't know.
You know, I think for writers, is whatever motivates them to get to the story, right? And so,
Yeah,
like for
yeah,
me too, and there's that adage that comparison's the thief of joy, and you know, if you're and you can compare as you do to your previous self, and so if you're not matching to your previous self, you're going to be you'll lose confidence, and then if you're and you might start ruminating, and the self-doubt creeps in, or in my case, will yell sometimes, right? And so, and then also other people, if you're comparing yourself to some people, their process, they can write thousands of words, and they're good words, and they're fantastic words, and fantastic story that works for them. If you're comparing yourself to them, and that's your barometer of success, that's for me anyway, that's going to keep me from writing. And I don't want to, obviously I'm a writer, so I gotta write.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to some people. Nick Snape, for example, who's in the previous podcast, he writes thousands of words a day. And you know, and I think, my goodness, I mean, I suppose if I was to average the word count, I'm sort of knocking on the door of 1,000 words a day, maybe, on a good day. But you know, there's life, isn't there? Life, there are distractions, and there's things that come together. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's whatever gets you to get the words out, whatever it takes, and everyone's different. So I think that's it's really good. It's a good thing to have, that freedom, I suppose, not to restrict yourself with time limits or word counts or something like that. I think that's perhaps probably the better way to go. Do you listen to any music? Do you listen to any music?
Yeah, on occasion I'll listen to instrumentals, but if there are lyrics, it'll distract me, and it'll get me out of this story. And I think writing is an act of empathy. You have to put yourself in the character's shoes, and anything that gets you out of those shoes will slow down the process of moving the character along through the trials and tribulations that you may put him or her through. So, but I will, and sometimes I'll find inspiration though from that type of music. I have this one story, this short story, it hasn't sold yet, but there's a Mongolian kind of flavor to it, and it came upon listening to Who, the heavy rock Mongolian band, and so I was kind of listening to it. It's like, okay, here's in the beginning of the story, and that's the story kind of became, the style of music. So, but in general, I need to be quiet, because there's a lot of voices going on in the head that I want to listen to.
Yeah, sure. Actually, you're not the first person who said that. It's really interesting that if you do listen to music, you can't listen to lyrics. Again, a few people I've spoken to have said the same thing. I'm kind of different in that respect. Lately, confession, I've started watching YouTube, and I've started watching gamers play through games.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's really weird. I have it on this screen here, so I write on this screen that's in front of us, and so I have it playing over here, and it's kind of as long as the game is comparable in action, etc., to the scene or the chapter that I'm writing, I find that it works really well. I can hear the voice, but it doesn't distract me. But then equally, I listen to rock music, again, depending on what scene I'm writing. But I have to have a voice. I have to hear another. I think we were saying earlier on, actually, before we sort of started, that as a writer, sometimes we suffer from cabin fever. Can't even speak. Cabin fever. And it's nice maybe for me to have another voice going on in the background. How do you kind of get across and get through cabin fever? Because I think we suffer it a lot as a writer.
Very, very much so. So it's difficult, right?
Yeah,
And I find myself becoming reclusive, and my
yeah,
mental health suffers
yeah.
because of it, because we're social creatures, and that's a need, is companionship. So I try to I volunteer to get
Oh,
out.
great. Yeah,
I
great.
also nature is a place that, even though it's not, it's a solitary thing. It's getting out of the house. It's important
Yeah,
for, so that gets me out there. But it's a challenge too. So
yeah. I think that's why these are great, just to be able to talk to another author. You kind of go through that sort of process as well. So yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
I often will go an entire day if my wife is out at work, where I won't get to speak to another real human other than the computer voice that's going on in my ear
Right.
on this side. So doing this, talking to you is such a nice thing for me to do, which is great. So let's talk about your work then. Let's talk about Snip Away from Freedom, because
Okay.
the way that you publish your work is different to the sort of other authors that I've spoken to, in as much that the other authors have got their books out on Amazon and all of those kind of places, in paperback and ebook and all that sort of stuff. But at this point in time, I should say, yours is quite different, isn't it? Talk about Snip Away the Freedom first, what it's about, and where it can be listened to, if you don't, without giving too much away, of course.
Okay. Right. So Step Away from Freedom is a horror story, and I guess it's the main character, Kara. She has two desires, and that is, number one, to get away from her abusive husband.
Hmm.
As a content warning, there is spousal abuse in there. But secondly, is also to be a YouTube crafting sensation. So, and she's the log line is she's one deadly snip away from achieving both those ends. And
Yeah.
so, it's currently published on Creepy Podcast, which is a fantastic horror podcast that publishes just some. If you're into horror, this is a lovely podcast for you to be inspired and to be entertained. But yeah, so the story is currently available on Creepy Podcast, and you can find it if you go to my website, jeschleicher.com. There'll be a link there as well. So.
Yeah, I'll make sure there's links to it in all the description, so we can go and click on it and go and have a listen. I've listened to it, I have heard it. So it's who's it narrated by?
So the narrator's Heather Thomas.
That's it, Heather. Yeah, 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 yeah. Okay.
Yeah, she did a phenomenal job, and that was a new experience, hearing somebody read out loud my stories.
I was going to
That's
say,
something that I do all the time, is to read aloud, just for the whole revision process, trying to listen for clunks right in the sentences,
yeah,
and
yeah,
such. But to hear somebody else read my story and kind of hear her adaptation, because that's what it is, adaptation of it, because of her own cadence of how she's reading it, etc., which I'm trying to guide, but it was delightful.
yeah.
And she does a fantastic job.
It's really entertaining. It's a really good listen. So what was it like working with her then? And you said that you acted as a guide. Did you have much sort of interaction with her backwards and forth, or how did it work?
No, so that was the interesting part. So it was very the process for publishing is, I mean, I sent them the story, they bought it, and there were no copy edits, and she read it as is. I don't know her process. But there wasn't any communication either. So it was kind of a delightful surprise, because there wasn't the conversation. I didn't know what was going to happen from it.
Yeah.
But to hear the story, her treatment of it. And so, yeah, when I say guide, it's, I have rhythm's really important, with my prose, that I hear it, and so, and I'm trying to guide the reader along to read the story as I hear it in my head, to better or for worse, as far as success on my end. So that's how it's a guide. But she was reading it right, word for word.
It was great. So how long did it take from you sending it to them producing it on the podcast itself? How long was that process?
So the process for short stories was very relatively quick, right? So the publishing industry is glacially slow,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
that's something that any writer has to come to terms with.
Yeah.
And I'm still coming to terms with it. But right. So I sent them the story. They bought the story within a couple of weeks, which is very quick turnaround for short story markets. And then it took a matter of a half a year or so before it was actually published.
Okay.
But I think on their end, that is also just because of the number of different stories too. So it's less of like that time period wasn't so much of them working on the story, right? It was just that it took a little bit for them to get to my story and then
Yeah.
to treat it as they treat it.
Well, that's really good. Well, I mean, I listened to it, and I did feel for Cara, obviously, but I don't think I'll ever look at Scissors in the same way again. So, yeah, I highly recommend it for anybody. As there'll be linked to it to your website where people can go to it from in the description below for the below this video. So yeah, you should go and listen to that. That's really good. So let's talk about Squiddy. Let's talk about that now. We kind of sort of touched on that earlier on that is your award-winning Future Writers Award-winning story. Tell us a little bit about that as well, without giving the story away.
Okay. So the log line would be, so when squids from outer space take over, a punk rock PI kind of must crawl out of her miserable existence to find her client's daughter and then maybe a way out. And so it's a neo-noir post-apocalyptic tale that occurs after squids invade Earth. So it's squid-like aliens
Okay.
that called squids. But they're an invasive species that kind of have a symbiotic, not kind of, they do have a symbiotic relationship with humans, but it's a parasitic relationship. So humans get high off them, become addicted to them, and ultimately die from the habit. So it's a very destructive habit. And then society, as modern society as we know it, collapses. And so, that's the speculative element. That's the arena I'm playing in. But really, the impetus for writing it, and is just kind of like how humans, how we deal with despair, how we seek ways to, and often self-destructive habits to soften that feeling of despair or to run away from it altogether. And so that's the short story. And so I'm working on the novel now, and that's been a joy, absolute joy, to really explore, because I'm that's with working with despair with the character Jocelyn. She's the main character. But in the novel, I get to explore kind of the antecedents to her despair. So what kind of caused it, and then that informs how she reacts to it later on. And so, but I'm right in the weeds, so to speak, of the first draft, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like down here, and barely looking over it. So we'll see how it comes out at the end. And stories they always surprise me. And then there'll be multiple revisions thereafter once I type the end.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, but it's great and wonderful process as well, isn't it? When you're going through and rewriting it and, not necessarily tidying it up, but adding things in that perhaps hadn't initially come to thought when you first started writing it, just to make it that little bit better, that little bit more spicy, just to draw your readers in that little bit more. Now, the short story that is, it's not available now, is that right? Did we
It's
say
not. So it will be published in May of
that's
2024.
Yeah.
And the cover, I'm very excited. So the cover reveal is actually in a couple of weeks, March 1st, or a week. But it's available to pre-order right now. So it's Rise of the Future Volume 40, and where like on Amazon you can pre-order it. And I'm sure where other like Barnes and Noble here in the US, wherever you can buy books, I'm sure you can buy it.
You'll be able to get it. So how far along are you with novelizing it? How much more work have you got to do? I mean, you said you're well.
I got a lot of work.
There's still a bit. So
right, I'm about 30,000 words in so far, and that first draft. And as I mentioned, I'm a slow writer, so it's gonna come along. I got several more months left, but we'll see.
Yeah. Do you have a kind of an idea in mind of when you would like to have it out, or just when it's ready?
To be determined. So right, so I have a non-traditional route from the authors that you speak to, where I have solely been working on short stories
Yeah.
and trying to get them bought and published in the traditional route of the short story market. So different zines and podcasts, I send them out and they accept them or decline them, etc. The novel, I don't know. I don't have my strategy yet as far as the publishing of it. Whether I'm going to go indie or if I'm going to query an agent to go the traditional route. It's whatever will get the most eyes on it. That's my goal. As a writer, I crave readers.
Sure. Yeah.
I want to be read, and so
Yeah.
the more eyes on it, the better. And so whatever strategy for publishing gets me that, it's to be determined.
Yeah.
But first, I just have to write the story.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally publishing, and as you said, you send it out to publishers. So, if you don't mind me asking, but how many times do you get a sort of, I hate the word rejection letter because that's not a nice thing. But do you know what I mean? How many times do people say it's not quite right for us this time?
Right. Oh, many. So some writers call them rejections, some maybe returns. That might be a kind of maybe a healthy way to look at it, right? Because there's such a negative association with rejection, especially as writers. You're putting your art form out there, which is part of yourself, and so when you get a no, or it's kind of like a rejection of your personal self, and so you have to kind of but it's also a rite of passage for any author. To not any author, but many authors to go through that. Octavia Butler, one of my favorite authors, she wrote this essay, and she mentioned the common denominator of amongst writers who are successful is persistence. And so that's just, you just got to keep sending your work out. And like Octavia Butler, I think she sold her first short story. It took her 6 years before she sold her second short story, before she became the acclaimed novelist that we know her as. And so that's what I have to do. And it's hard though. I'm not going, and you have to change your relationship with rejection. So like for short story markets, I have a catalog about 20 stories that I send out. I've published 3, and to get to those 3, there's a lot of rejections, and I've well over 200 rejections from magazines. And how I handle it is I try to make it positive, change my relationship. So like for a long time, I kind of a la Stephen King from On Writing, he tacked up his rejection letters. I did the same thing.
Got a bigger nail.
And the bigger, I view the ever widening thickness of my rejection letters is kind of like a proud accomplishment. Like, oh, look at me go.
Yeah.
And then I had this meme of the dude from The Big Lebowski, and where he goes, oh, well, that's just like your opinion, man. And so I put that on front of my rejections, because that's what it is. It's an editor's opinion. And then a rejection also doesn't mean that it's a bad story. It's just not the right story for them at that time. They could have already published a similar story, a similar theme just recently. Or your voice doesn't, they're not seeing it. It's not their style. Just like readers, they're very varied in interest in what they're looking for. Same thing with editors. And so I have to remember that when I get a rejection, that's what that is. It's not, I haven't found the home yet for the story. And so I have to send it right back out. And so I try to, and when I get the rejection, my goal is to get that same story out that same day to a different market, just to find a different home for it.
Yeah, I think you're right about publishing houses looking for specific things at a specific time. And so, for example, when Twilight was out, if you were writing about vampires and werewolves, you're good, So they're kind of looking for that sort of stuff. So yeah, I suppose it is a matter of hitting it at the right time with the right subject, with the right story. And I think that's really important, that that persistence. You just got to keep going and don't quit, and eventually it will pay off. Well, yeah,
and I think that actually helps too with writing your best story. You're not chasing aftermarkets, right? Because one, the market's so slow.
Yeah.
So it, said vampires are really hot because of Twilight. By the time that an editor reads your story, and if they say yes, I'm going to publish it, it's going to be, if you're talking about novels and your traditional house, is going to be a year or a year and a half before it's even published. So they're thinking, they're looking at the story really. And so if you write the story that you want to write, if you understand that, then that's good. You're gonna, every time you show up, you're just gonna write the best story and be more genuine, because authenticity matters so much for readers. And they can smell it if you're not authentic. If you're writing something you don't enjoy, it's going to come across in the prose and the story, etc. You keep phoning it in.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. With Squiddy, then, that's coming out with the anthology. There's also some artwork that's being done with that as well, isn't? Are they doing that? I've got here, it's Tyler Vale that's doing the artwork for it. Now he's an illustrator and a concept artist. So have you seen what he's going to be producing for it?
I haven't, and I can't wait to see it. So part of that workshop is they have the illustration reveal. So Writers of the Future, there's a writing contest, and on a given year, 12 winners have their stories published. Now, there's also part of the contest, there's the Illustrators of the Future contest. And so illustrators are also trying to win this contest. And if they win, then they get paired with a story, and they do the illustration for the story. And so part of the workshop is they have this illustration reveal where you walk into the room and you find your story, and then the illustrator, Tyler Vale, will be my illustrator. It will be standing there, and I get to see what he did with the story. And I'm sure it'll be a emotional experience, just the kind of see, okay, this is how I saw it. Let's see a very talented illustrator, his or her interpretation of it.
Yeah, that's and will you get to keep it, or will you get to buy it, or will they be on sale? How will that work? Because that's
right. So will it be, I actually have, so here's the Writers of the Future. This is last year's volume, and then in the book itself they'll have the illustrated version. So and then you are sent home with a print, which you better believe will be framed, possibly tattooed on me. So we'll see.
That's fantastic. Well, that's such a great thing to have. I'm looking forward to seeing it as well. So I say I'm going to be pre-ordering it. So I can't wait to see it. Which is one of the reasons with the illustrations, because that's so rare. These days in a book that you buy, to have something that's got really good illustration for it, comes with it, adds so much value in my eyes anyway, which is cool. Let's talk about The Poacher then. So that is well, I'll let you tell the story and where people can go and read it.
Right. So The Poacher it's a flash story. So less than 1,000 words. So you jump in, you jump out. And that's a different skill set to be able to pull that off. And so so The Poacher is a horror. It's The Poacher, she's a creature who loves her jazz, loves her scotch, and then also has found the fountain of youth, which is thread, needle, and skin. And there's gore involved, and you're in and out really quick. And it's 1,000 words or less. And so it's available Black Hair Press. They bought the flash story, and so the Patreon supporters of Black Hair Press can read it now. So that is available for them. It will be in an anthology, their end of the year anthology they put out every year, and it's titled Year 6. Their 6th anthology. So, and that will be out, I believe in 2025, but I'm not sure on the release date.
Yeah, that's really good. So what's really interesting is that you've got your work out there as audio, short flash stories, short stories in anthologies, and then you're going to have them coming out sort of individually later on as well. So you've got a kind of a double stab at it, if you like.
Right.
So that's really good. That's such a great way to go. I absolutely love it. So all of these are available now, or certainly that one with Black Hair Press is available now on their Patreon. So I'll put a link to that. Or would you just want people to go to your website? Which would you prefer?
Oh, right. So yeah, if you go to my website, well, actually, no. So as of now, but after this interview, I'll make sure there's a link to it. But I just found out that it was released, and so on my website I haven't put in the hyperlink. But that's it. It's a quick fix. So yes, definitely go to my website, JEschleicher.com, and then you'll be able to read The Poacher.
Yeah, that's great. How long did it take you to write? It's kind of like 1,000 words or thereabouts.
That was a
story straight away.
That was a quick one.
Yeah.
I don't remember. I wrote it a couple years ago too, and shopped it out for a while before it was bought. So, but that was probably a day or a couple days to write it.
Nice. That's really good. When you got a story that can come out as quickly as that, that's really good. So, what else have you got coming out? What's in the future?
Right. So the future right now is Squiddy. So that's coming out in May. And that's where I'm cutting my Riley teeth with as I develop the novel. And so I don't have, as I mentioned, I don't have the strategy yet of how and when that will be published, but that's where I'm at. And then I'm shopping out my short stories. So there will be, more stories that are bought and then therefore published. And, the best thing to do is to go to my website. And also you can, on my website, as many authors, you can get updated, join my mailing list, right? But I have a blog on there called Dopamine's Delight. And so the blog is where I share my different delights that find me, I find them. And then I'll also share my stories because whenever I get them published, it's quite a delightful feeling. So I'll definitely really share them.
Yeah. John, that's fantastic. Listen, so I'll put links to everything and we'll discuss those shortly so people can get to find your stuff and connect with you easily. And so once we're done here, that's where it'll be. You'll find all the links and everything there. So listen, let's wrap it up there for today. Listen, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you, sort of listening to how your work has been developed and how you're publishing it, which I find absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much for coming on. And hopefully what I'd like you to do, if you wouldn't mind, is once you've got Squiddy novelized and everything is ready, come back to me and we'll do this again.
Absolutely, Paul. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I appreciate this platform too, to talk about my writing and just the creative process, because it's a fascinating thing. It's so different with everybody. And so I love to have that conversation, but also just to learn and from others and tweak my own. So
absolutely. Listen, so thanks ever so much, John, and we'll speak again.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul. And
thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us on another captivating episode of the Page Turnerz Podcast. We hope you enjoyed delving into the pages with us, discovering new stories, and revisiting beloved classics. If you're as passionate about books as we are, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and leave a review. Your feedback keeps us bringing you fascinating discussions, author interviews, and book recommendations. Remember, the adventure never ends when you have a book in hand. Until next time, keep turning those pages and let the magic of storytelling continue to inspire your imagination. Happy reading.